Okay, so Lorcan, director of Vivarium, thank you for speaking to me today. How is lockdown life in Dublin?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, lockdown life is okay. The weather's good. Um, I mean, I mostly work from home anyway, and talk to people that I'm working with on Skype and Zoom and all that. So it's not totally unusual, but it is pretty weird not being able to kind of see anybody.
And on that, on the idea of not seeing anybody, obviously now the film Vivarium, it's coming out at a slightly odd time because obviously it premiered at Cannes last year. So you've kind of got this whole, and I saw it at Glasgow Film Festival in February, like, or it might even been early March, the showing I saw, right
March,
before
yeah.
all this stuff kicked off, or at least when it kicked off in the UK and Ireland. I'm sure other places were aware of it by then. How odd has that been for you to get the kind of the full audience experience for almost the best part of a year, and then basically have the theatrical release just kind of the rug pulled out from under you right at the end, basically?
Yeah, it was obviously it was sickener, yeah. That it didn't get the theatrical release that we'd planned. I mean, it actually did come out in France. France had a window of 2 weeks before everybody else. The distributor there just managed to organize that somehow. But yeah, so it came out in France, and I went over for the premiere, and yeah, it came out on a Wednesday, and then Thursday the French president sort of announced that schools were closing down, and then like on Friday the cinemas were closed, and that was the end of it. But it did pretty well for like a day. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, yeah, it's just the way things went, and it's weirdly then became kind of this lockdown, ultimate lockdown movie. All these people started labeling it as oddly prescient, and so it's not the worst though. I mean, like there's people who would have been premiering their films at festivals, South by Southwest suddenly cancelled, and I knew people who were going to show their film for the first time, and they're excited, they got in, and then obviously Cannes isn't happening now, and yeah, so like we're lucky, really. We had a great festival run, and then it was going to be a day and date release in the UK anyway,
No.
and the US. So although it was doing theatrical, it was also going to be going out on VOD at the same time. So
I was wondering if it's made you think a little about how much the historical context in which a film comes out plays a role in how an audience engages with it. Because now, obviously, when you're coming up with ideas and stuff, that informs that process as well. But I rewatched the film recently because I knew I was going to be speaking to you about it, and it's quite funny to me, at least, how I engage with different aspects of it upon watching it a second time. So, I mean, the first time there's all the things to do with, the ideas of motherhood and social contract, and kind of you getting locked into this kind of suburban non-escape almost. But then when I was watching it the second time, it was the idea that they literally can't go anywhere or particularly do anything, which really registered with me. And the bit that really stuck out to me is when they're dancing to Desmond Decker and the Aces in front of the car, when they suddenly realise that the car radio still works. So I was wondering if, because of course now you've had that long period for audiences to engage it in what was previously normal, I suppose, and now I was wondering if is that something you've found yourself, and when you've been speaking to people about it, or when you've reflected on it?
Yeah, well, I didn't, like, nobody knew that me and Garrett were precogs before now. Even though we share a bath and we have wires coming out of our heads. No, it was, I mean, I'll never get to experience it like that. You know, the way, like, I'll never even get to experience like a normal audience member pre-COVID, because you're inside it, making it, so you never really get to kind of experience it as an audience member anyway. But now, yeah, I haven't actually watched it. I mean, I've known the film pretty well, obviously, but I haven't watched it since all of this. But I have seen, like, and I've done a bunch of interviews for the US, asking about this sort of lockdown thing and how it seems as if it was designed exactly for a kind of like a nightmare version of the social contract mixed with COVID-19. And like, you know, there's all sorts of weird things then, you know, once it started, once we became aware of all of the symptoms and all of the kind of the restrictions that were going to be put into place and everything, you start seeing all these weird parallels in the film, you know, with one, they're stuck in the house with this annoying child who's driving them mad. You know, the male protagonist starts to make 2 gardening projects, which I think a lot of people are doing. And then, you know, he gets a mysterious illness that he is slightly unexplained in the film anyway. And boxes arrive with supplies, which, you know, there's just so many weird parallels. But I guess in some sense, like I've always thought that films like this seem as if, you know, they're part of a collective unconscious anyway, that like when you're reacting to what's going on socio-politically and you're kind of working on a project about that in a slightly abstracted way, some of those concerns and ideas, I don't know, it all kind of gets swept up and turns into a film. And maybe in some way it is a weird precognitive thing or something. I don't know. Strange though. Yeah.
Yeah, and in particular, yeah, the when Tom, Jesse Eisenberg's character, starts digging a random hole in the garden, it did bring to mind that story about how DIY injuries have gone up in the past month.
Right, have they? Yeah.
Yeah, I read that story recently. It was something like so not directly, but it was like eye injuries related to kind of doing work around the house have like increased by a factor of 3 in England or something like that.
Yeah.
Because everybody's at home like drilling holes in their wall or something.
Yeah, trying to go mad. Yeah, I mean, we did actually have a scene in the film that we cut, but it was the boy asking Tom why is he digging, and I think he said because everyone needs a job. It's like, why do people need jobs? And he said because if they didn't, they'd go crazy.
Well,
something along those lines.
So I would moving on to kind of more the content of the film. So obviously, the film doesn't give a lot away in terms of explanations, and I think the fact that people are pulling different things out of it depending on how they've seen it speaks to that. It's kind of got one. I don't want to call it an explanation, but there's kind of a sequence at the start with a cuckoo that kind of sets up the central metaphor, if you like. The other stuff revolves around. Now, I haven't had the good fortune to see the short that you made, which this project kind of spinned out of. But how did you approach that from a sort of like the writing and the conception standpoint? Because it must be quite hard to write something which is so ambiguous, because obviously it has that starting point where it kind of sets that metaphor up, but after that there are quite a lot of things that are open to interpretation or might come through more strongly to other people. So how do you approach creating that sort of story, I suppose?
Well, I worked with the screenwriter Garrett Shanley, so he wrote the scripts, and we it didn't seem that kind of that mysterious to us, I guess, at the time. And also, I mean, we probably had way more explanation in the script or in earlier drafts, and then started like pulling things out, and then also in the edit taking certain things out that seem, you know, that a lot of the time I think you're using visual language to convey a feeling or an atmosphere, a kind of a contrast between the characters, or, you know, that you can do with an image a lot of the time, and their facial expressions, that you don't necessarily need them to be explaining stuff through dialogue or whatever. And that was definitely the case with this film. found just pulling out, like if they kind of referenced their weird situation within the weird situation, it didn't really work in the same way as being stuck in your own kind of fever dream works, you know. So and that was something we talked about with the actors very early on. Jesse and Imogen were both on the same page as well. They actually wanted, I think there were a few scenes that had a little bit more exposition that we took out. We gave them less dialogue in certain parts. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that they're the kind of films that I'm interested in, and find it enjoyable and challenging to sort of to do that while making a film. But this film in particular, I mean, if you explained everything that was happening, it would just lead to more questions, you know. And we weren't making, you know, Lost. So yeah, we did actually shoot a few more scenes that we didn't put into the final cut of the film during that last sequence. But yeah, I don't think they would have answered. I don't think they would have answered more anyway. They probably would have created more questions.
How much time as a director did you put into thinking about how to convey the passage of time? Because obviously it's quite, it's by its very nature of the story, it's a very kind of similar setting from scene to scene, but obviously you need to convey the fact that Tom and Jem are kind of slowly losing their minds a little bit, and obviously you've got the added complication of the child ages at a much faster rate than a human child. Yeah. And I noticed there were all these kind of like little things that were intended to convey the passage of time. So like the measurement against the door frame is kind of like a very nice, quick way of kind of establishing that aging speed. But how much time did you put into coming up with kind of these things, even like changes in terms of how they're doing their hair or the makeup or things like that? Because that's kind of a central thing to getting across how much time they've actually spent there. I know that wouldn't necessarily, to my mind, be explicit in the script, or if it is, it might just be a passing note.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because there was definitely challenges in, you know, we weren't shooting in a real location. We had a set of just 3 exteriors in a warehouse. So, you know, say you were shooting, and if you see Fox's, the short film, it's on Vimeo and YouTube and stuff. It's in a similar kind of environment, but it was a real location, and we were able to shoot, you know, cutaways to like between buildings or trees, the sky or whatever, and to help show the passage of time. But obviously with this, it's something to shoot, you know, you turn the camera around and you'll see like a brick wall. And a bunch of equipment and wires and stuff. So there were a few kind of techniques. One of them was using the sun and these sort of overlays to create this sort of dreamy sense of time passing and dissolves. So you get the sense of both atmospherically things becoming quite surreal, and also that time is passing, and they've tried a few things. So we did a bit of that with like audio, just and that was always kind of a plan, which we were going to do in ADR and also in the edit, take like got the actors to read passages of dialogue saying you should turn this way and around that way, like when they're trying to get out of the place. And Jesse did that and Imogen did that, and then we kind of mixed them together and overlaid them and cross-faded them while simultaneously dissolving these sequences over the sun and their faces kind of dissolving into each other, which was probably inspired by a bunch of things. But what I remember is that Saul Bass's film Phase 4 did some of that kind of stuff. So there's a bit of that. And then in terms of their physicality and sort of weakening over time and degradation, both the makeup artist and hair were brilliant. You know, so we talked a lot about what we could do, and Jenny, who was looking after her hair, had this brilliant idea about sort of giving Imogen a different like stages of her hair. So like it's down and then it's up and then it goes into this kind of sad ponytail. So the like low ponytail and greasier. And same with Jesse, his hair kind of got like a bit, it was kind of fluffy at the sort of fro at the start, and then it becomes kind of dank and limp. And then obviously with makeup, we sort of made them look sick as well. And we also had, because they stay in the same wardrobe the entire time, we did get change the size though. So they start with kind of well-fitting clothes, and then they're bigger, and then they're even bigger again in the third act. So it was very much broken down across. To me, anyway, it was like a representation of youth, middle age, and old age within the 3 acts of the film, even though they weren't getting like grey hair and big beard. In a slightly more abstracted way, but yeah. So the wardrobe, I think, helps because the shoulders start sagging down here. It kind of gives the impression that they've lost weight and they're just looking a bit more rough. And then also, I think the set being painted, the color is painted that sort of greeny pastel hue. It bounces this sort of greenish light back onto them. So we're able to also in the grade adjust the skin tone accordingly to sort of help them deteriorate as well. And I think all of that adds to the passage of time, like because it's as if it's difficult to tell exactly. Well, how long do you think passed? How long time do you think passed for them?
I mean, by the time it was done, I mean, well over a year, I would have thought. I mean, just on the basis that when you get the first indication of any passage of time, you're already past 3 months, basically. So I think on that sort of basis, something like that in my head, I suppose.
Yeah. That's about it. That was what we aimed for. So yeah, and then obviously the markings on the door was a very sort of simple way of doing that, and also the introduction to the boy at the beginning of the second act where he does his little play. It was a way of kind of it was like previously on Vivarium, the stuff that you'd missed, to kind of catch up with the story for the audience anyway.
On the look of the film, because I kind of went a bit down a rabbit hole when I was thinking about this, and actually circled back to some other interviews you'd done. What were the main influences on the look of the film? Because the thing that when they're outside the home in the evening, it rather reminded me of the exterior, or the kind of the famous still from The Exorcist. And I found that quite interesting because then I found the painting which inspired that, which I then found out in another interview was actually, or series of paintings, which then inspired the look of the neighborhood they find themselves in, with these, the perfect house, and then that disconnect between the way it looks in the exterior and all the rest of it. So I was wondering, between kind of like films and artwork, what were I mean, obviously there's a lot of influences that have probably gone into this, right? But what are the main ones that come to mind when you were conceiving of it?
For the aesthetic, I mean, part of the inspiration was like technical, and part of it was artistic, and it's probably a blend of the two in the middle. Like that painting Empire of Light by René Magritte was in the script as a reference for the kind of surreal stillness of the place and the clouds being all kind of fluffy white clouds in the sky and looking a little bit like a weird painting. So that it was always the intention to make the place look quite surreal and still. It had no wind, no rain, no insects, all that stuff, and it had to be have a feeling of being totally artificial, but at the same time tangible. So I wanted to have this artificial light and this artificial sunlight kind of a feel to the place. So once we kind of knew that that was the intention, then we had to figure out how to do it, which meant building a set in a controlled environment and lighting it with artificial light and all that kind of stuff. So then it's like I was looking at, well, I was a fan of Roy Andersson's films anyway, but I started looking at some of the breakdown stuff on Songs on the Second Floor and A Pigeon Sat on the Branch, and
it's funny you mention that, actually, because I saw at Glasgow Film Festival, I saw Roy Andersson's latest film, like literally, I think a few days after seeing Vivarium. So that was quite clear that, like, even that kind of like the kind of like pallid sort of reflected green light that seems to kind of, you know, I think Songs from the Second Floor and You the Living are the ones that I was thinking of when I saw it, I think.
Right, cool, yeah. So so that, you know, he builds these sets that are exteriors, then lights them. So it was very handy to look at that kind of stuff in relation to Vivarium. And then also probably in terms of artistic references, like, or aesthetic references, the photography of Gregory Crutzen. The Sun was sort of based on Oliver Ellison's weather project that was in the Tate in London years ago. He built this big fake sun. Oh, okay. And then the repetition in the photography of Andreas Gursky was an inspiration as well. And then in terms of films, like things like Antonioni's Red Desert, Teshigara's Woman in the Dunes, David Lynch's Lost Highway, Jeff Murphy's film Quiet Earth.
In terms of creating this sort of the artificial yet tangible environment you've spoken about, one of the things which really jumped out to me on the first viewing was taking the dialogue from The Child and dubbing over Jonathan Harris over the top of it, who's in the film at the start as the sort of the very creepy, weird estate agent, right, which is a fantastic performance. I absolutely loved that. But one thing I was wondering was when that idea came about, because I found it quite an interesting idea in that, if you know the idea of the uncanny valley that they talk about in kind of like computer generated graphics, I found it quite an interesting idea because it was almost like an audio version of the uncanny valley. It's like you know something's not quite right. It, like, you know, it seems fine, but it's just, you know, it's not. And I thought that was a wonderful way to kind of get across another aspect of kind of the unreality of it. So I was wondering at what point that idea came in. Whether that came late, if it was always conceived that way, or
it was conceived that way, but it was obviously impossible to make the Sen and Jennings. I tried to speak that way. So in the script, he was supposed to have this horrible kind of way of copying Tom and Gemma, kind of accurately, but a little bit wrong, because he's not human. He kind of lacks all humanity, and, you know, it's all an approximation of humanity or something. So like Senan is brilliant, and so he did all the dialogue though in his own voice, which made him too endearing. But I knew we were going to do something with it in audio post-production to make him less human, and therefore the scenes where you know, Tom throws him down on the ground or they drag him off into the car and stuff would seem like you know, you could relate to it, and you might do it yourself. You might go further, which most people probably would. But his scream was actually his kind of shrieking thing was totally real. We actually had to bring that down a couple of octaves because it was just too shrill. And he loved doing it. Like, I was afraid, you know, props would start smashing on set. But yeah, so when we were editing the film, we did think about, we hadn't thought about it being Jonathan, but we did have this slight problem, which was Senan had this Dublin accent, kind of neutral Dublin accent. Aina, who is the older version, has a kind of slight Cork accent. And then Jonathan has this British accent. So there, and that was just the way it worked out, casting and all that. But we kind of knew that we could make it work in audio post because the guy's it's such a strange character. You can kind of play with it anyway. You aren't stuck to the rules of reality too much. So while we're cutting it, we're thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if Jonathan did the boy? So we mailed Jonathan or gave him a call or something, and he said he'd do a little demo. So we gave him a little bit of the a clip, I think, when he was being measured, actually, that section. And he did a demo. I think he was in a studio doing some ADR or voiceover or something like that. And he recorded it there, sent it over, and we lined it up. And it was like, oh shit, this is pretty good. It wasn't quite right, you know. It was the lip sync wasn't exact, and but we could see that there's definitely some weird potential there, that it could work really well. So we basically said that's what we were going to do, and stuck with it, even though there was a lot of kind of resistance from people listening to it when it was still rough, and financiers and all that kind of stuff going, I don't think that's going to work. But I knew Jonathan would be able to nail the lip sync better, and then we could manipulate it. I was working with some brilliant sound designers in Denmark then afterwards. So that took ages, though, mixing the boy's voice, like the real boy, in with Jonathan, back in with the real boy, and then also the older boy, and all of that. And we had to add a lisp because Senan had a slight lisp as he spoke, and Jonathan didn't. So we had to get Jonathan to add a slight one, but then we also had to like pull out certain vowels in post, and then add in the kind of lip smacks that you normally take out in dialogue editing. So we increased the sound of the little clicks to help it fit into the boy's mouth, and yeah. So just it took a good bit of time, but I think it was worth it.
Yeah, so no, it definitely was. I thought it really added to it. It's interesting to hear how difficult it was to do in post production as well, because at first, when I was first watching it, I only found out after I'd seen it the first time that's the technical process you'd gone through. But I was just like, I was very taken aback when I was watching. I was like, oh, this sounds so weird, but is that him? Is that him? Like, yeah. So for me anyway, it certainly achieved the desired effect. How challenging did you find the production process? Because as I understand it, you filmed exterior shots in Ireland. I might be getting this wrong, but the interior shots, I think, were also in Ireland, but then the exterior of the house on the street was in Belgium, and that's where you had the setup with the three. How challenging was it to manage that shoot? Because I'm not aware off the top of my head like what your time frame was on when the different bits happened.
Yeah, it was a nightmare. Is the way of describing it. It was we. Once Jesse came on board, he had a window to shoot, so prep kind of got condensed, and it was like a big rush to get ready to shoot on day one. Like, I was painting the set with everybody else the night before shooting. We were all like covered in paint and sweeping up all the dust, and trying to put a roof on. You know, it was, and there was no crew available and all that kind of stuff. It was madness. But then the set originally was supposed to be 3 times, slightly more than 3 times the size that it was. So we're supposed to have like the opposite side of the street in here, and then a kind of junction across the bottom. But it was all too expensive, so we were only able to build a section 3, which meant having to shoot all reverse angles back into the same direction. So it meant flipping the lights every time we needed to reverse and flip the car and take the 9 off the door and take the hole away and clean the grass and tuck it in and all that kind of stuff. And then everything was reflective as well. The car was like a mirror with all the glass, and the house was covered in glass reflecting back the crew, because there was no opposite side of the street. So it was tricky. Yeah, it was very tricky. But we kind of came up with some solutions, and one of those, actually going back to the design and around that painting and the Empire of Light and the Exorcist and stuff with the single street light outside, like that was originally we were supposed to have a row of lights that would kind of, they were supposed to sit like little spotlights, you know, boom, boom, boom along the street and go off into the distance. But that became impossible to do practically. So we said, okay, we'll have one light just outside their house, which ended up becoming much more like the painting than we'd even, I'm only thinking about it now for the first time since you mentioned The Exorcist. I forgot that that was based on that painting as well. So yeah, and then we, for the nighttime shots, we had to, we fogged up the area so that you create, you know, additional depth because of the diffusion, like aerial diffusion.
Yeah.
So there was all of that kind of stuff was pretty challenging. And then the hole that Tom digs, we couldn't actually dig a hole there because the floor is concrete, and it was like it would have been impossible to actually take out the floor because underneath the concrete is all this kind of steel mesh. So we were only able to go as deep as the day one photography, which there was a step outside the house, which is about like that height. So we were only able to raise the stage, the height of the step, minus about an inch, so people wouldn't really notice. So the hole's about that deep. So like Jesse would have to jump into it, you know, with some stuff obscuring the side, like dirt piled up, and then cross his legs as he'd go into it, like kind of a yoga position. And then we had a shovel that was only the handle of a shovel sliced in half that he'd kind of stick in. And then the interiors were all in Ireland, yeah, and they were all built as well, sets. So they were a little bit like the exterior set insofar as you couldn't, you know, there was no ceiling a lot of the time, or there was no, you know, you couldn't just kind of shoot out a window because you'd just be looking into nothing, an empty studio. So keeping the kind of emotional energy right between all of that stuff and the continuity, you know, when they'd be going into the house and out of the house, but it was across a couple of different countries, was also quite challenging and tricky. But I had 2 brilliant actors, so they made my life a lot easier. Like all of the physical shooting and production stuff was yeah, kind of a nightmare. But actually the actors were brilliant, and they made it all a pleasure.
Where do you want to go next with your filmmaking? Because obviously, I haven't seen your previous feature, but I understood you worked with Garrett on that as well. So is that something you would like to do going forward? Like continue to work with kind of the same writer, for instance, and kind of have this very collaborative thing, or would you prefer to try and look at some other work? And just where do you see it yourself going from here?
Probably the kind of rom-com market is pretty big. You know? Yeah, no, I'm working with Garrett on 2 new scripts, 2 new. We're starting to cast a film. I don't know when we're going to shoot with all of this going on, not until probably until they have a vaccine or something. But we started casting it, and we've been working on the script for a couple of years. And we're on the second draft of another project, and we have an outline for a third project. So, and they're all pretty odd films. The one we're supposed to be doing next is called Nocebo, and it's like the opposite to a placebo. And I mean, the word is the opposite to a placebo. And it's about a fashion designer and a Filipino nanny and how their lives come together. Their kind of fates intertwine. And it's really about the fast fashion industry and the exploitation of the East by the West, and it's a supernatural thriller set between the Philippines and London. And we're working on this kind of dystopian fable, which is a reimagining of the David and Goliath story called Goliath. And it's pretty cool. That's the one we're on the second draft with. And then we started working on a Sasquatch film as well. So they're all quite different, but all interesting thematically to me. Anyway.
So they all sound really interesting, and I'm very much looking forward to your future work. Thank you for Vivarium, a film that I enjoyed greatly, and certainly the audience at the Glasgow Film Festival seemed to enjoy it as well. So thank you for taking the time to talk to me, Lorcan, and best of luck for the future.
You're very welcome, and thanks very much.
No problem.